What's up, guys? It's Johnny Candido of Candido Training HQ. Today I want to answer a question from Twitter, and that was by a guy named Joe Candido. What a great last name. He asks, hyped up versus calm lifting. Should you save up when to get hyped up? So before I want to answer this directly, of course we have to go through really a series of points, and the first one is that everybody is obviously different. So this is actually something I want to bring up is Mike Tashir gave a phenomenal talk on personality differences, and he based it off of the Big Five, more specifically the Big Five inventory, which is, I believe, a 44-question quiz. So I'm going to put a link in the description so that you guys can report your personality type and if you prefer to get hyped up all the time internally or just not hyped up at all. So basically what's funny is that the results for the average powerlifter in his group was people who tend to be high in conscientiousness, low in openness, kind of what you would expect from someone doing something repetitive. And what's funny is I'm the complete opposite, where I was 93rd percentile on openness and I was 4th percentile on conscientiousness.
That means my life's a mess, a creative and open-minded mess.
But anyway, specifically to this question, what he found was those who tend to be high in neuroticism tend to also get hyped up more often. So what he was saying is, in his mind, his theory is that aggressiveness can kind of be used to that nervous energy where you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. If you attack it and also get aggressive yourself, then you don't necessarily kind of let yourself fall into that trap of fading away from the moment. So I think that's a really good theory. Now, the one criticism that I have of his presentation, which of course I'll also link in the description, is it looked at people who get hyped up internally versus externally, and then versus externally some of the time. But what I didn't like is that there wasn't an option for people who just simply don't get hyped up very much. So that's going to be my next point here, is that there is a distinct difference between getting hyped up internally and not getting hyped up. And it's very important for you to at least ask a question if you see someone who is a high-level lifter who you're trying to emulate. It's important to ask them, are they actually psyched up in their mind? Because I believe someone like Jesse Norris, when he pulled over 800 pounds at the animal cage, I think a comment said that they're amazed that you don't even seem that excited. And he said internally, he was very excited, very built up and anxious. So maybe not anxious, but excited. So it's very important to think about that. So don't just try to emulate someone who seems like a very calm, mature lifter. And then if you're not actually getting hyped at all while they are just internally, then you're going to be potentially at a disadvantage just by mimicking them when it wasn't really appropriate. So, of course, you already shouldn't just mimic people just for the sake of it, but it's just something to keep in mind. I think the best way to look at it is to just imagine heart rate as opposed to external factors. So, of course, someone who's going to be shouting is going to be more likely to be extroverted versus someone who's not. But if the heart rate's very similar in both people, then I would say that they're in same degrees of excitement. So that's something that you want to think about. And there are people who really do not get excited. For example, those who run the Bulgarian method, the squat program where you're squatting every day, going to a daily minimum and then possibly daily max, those types tend to actually not even get excited, not even take that extra time to get their heart rate up. So what I would say is the prime examples in each group would probably be Eric Bugenhagen. I don't think that there's a single person who gets more hyped up than him. So he's the perfect extroverted, hyped up guy. And then I would say Jesse Norris seems to me like he could potentially be the one who's more internal and psyched up. And then someone like, let's say Pete Rubish, when he goes for a squat, I've seen where he's just joking around. Greg Knuckles I've also seen do the same thing, where he's joking around, seems very lighthearted. Now, I don't know, sometimes even people joking and laughing, sometimes that's actually a sign of nervousness, and you can misinterpret that. But that would be my inclination, is that they seem like they're really actually calm. Okay, so that's just all in making sure that you have the proper perspective on these different types. But in terms of actual application, to answer the question directly, can you get hyped up too often? I think absolutely yes. And I think that this really stems from where you are at in your training cycle. I think you should have some idea of when you want to get hyped up and at what stage in it and how often. So for example, for myself on the deadlift, I tend to get hyped up for about 1 or 2 sets a week. And a lot of times if I'm doing a program where I have one top single, I'll intentionally make sure I'm hyped up for that and then make sure on the back off work that I don't have to get hyped up for that. Because it's usually not if you get too hyped up too often while hitting big weights. What it really is when you have to get hyped up to just hit back off volume work. When you're on your 4th set and you're then trying to get hyped up, usually that's where you snap something up, because that's when you're really redlining. Whereas if you're just getting as hyped up as possible for a top set, there really is no top limit. So of course it is lift specific. I would say on the deadlift, usually you have 1 to 2 sets to get hyped up. On the bench press, you probably could get fairly hyped up, at least to the point where it's going to be useful on nearly every set. But then on the squat, that's where it definitely is a little bit in that middle ground, where it'll make a difference in terms of how light it feels on racking, but it's not really going to make that big of a difference since it's a pretty high-skilled lift where you have to have proper tempo and you have to really hit your spots correctly. Whereas on the deadlift, especially conventional, you could kind of just grip and rip. A tip that I do for the deadlift on volume days is I intentionally say, okay, if I'm going to get hyped up, I'm intentionally going to save that for the very last set. So if I'm doing a 5x5 with over 500 pounds, I'm going to make sure the first 4 sets are all without hype and then just let myself get psyched up for that last set. And then a lot of times what will happen is then the speed will be even better than all the other sets. So it can make, in my opinion, it can make well over 50 pounds of a difference for me. But it's just important to keep that in mind, because if you try to force that early on, then you're only going to have fatigue and the decrease in psych up add up on you, and then that's when you're really most prone to have something bad going on. Now in the squat, I've actually found it to be a little bit of the opposite in some senses, because a lot of times if you get that first set out the way where it feels light on your back, then you're fine. So I will say that it's a little bit more of a mental battle sometimes on a lift where you actually have to feel the weight on your back. It's kind of like in a meet. I know Joey Flex has talked about this, where when you go 3 for 3 on squats, that everything just starts building up. So I definitely think that that's the case, whereas you never really see in a meet if someone smokes their opener deadlift that it really has that big of an impact. And the reason why this has a tangible effect on your programming is because even if you're running an RPE-based program, which should adjust as well as any program possible to each day, if you do an RPE 8 single while fully hyped up on the first week, then you're going to have to be fully hyped up on every single after that if that's what you're planning based off of. So you can't do an RPE 8 or RPE 7, let's say week 1, and then go to RPE 8 or 8.5 while not psyched up and expect that to just gradually work linearly in the same way. So you have to make sure that you can replicate that. And that's why it is something that I think you should plan out to some extent, because the worst thing that you can do in a training cycle is start out too heavy, then kind of have nowhere to go. So honestly, I don't think it would even be a bad idea to have a psych up scale along with an RPE scale if that's how you train, because then you could just normalize it to 1 out of 10 on how psyched you are and then how the RPE is. And then of course with percentages, the difference can only be even greater, since there you're making even less adjustments. Another thing I wanted to address is I get a lot of questions about if you should listen to music in training, because that might not translate into a meet performance where you don't get your favorite song. Now, in my opinion, I think that this is really overthinking it, and I think it's not even the right question to ask, because music has no intrinsic value when it comes to training. It's not like the actual lyrics to your song are what's powering your legs to then squat more. All that matters, in my opinion, is heart rate and general excitement. So I think heart rate probably would be the best way, as I said, to objectively track that. And do you think your heart rate's going to be even less at a meet? Then even if you had your favorite song, it's not going to be the same as a meet where everybody's watching you and where the excitement's built up. So either way, the effect is going to be exactly the same and probably even less still. So I think that with questions like that, it's important to think about what is the end cause that we're actually looking at, rather than making these loose connections and then trying to overthink specificity. All right, so my last point when it comes to picking days where you are more psyched up is to track the milligrams of caffeine that you intake. Now, to some people, this may be basic information, but I know for a fact that most people I talk to don't even track at all the milligrams of caffeine, don't even think to, and they just look at caffeine as products, basically. So they'll say, okay, a Monster gets me this amount of psyched up, or NO Explode gets me this amount psyched up, rather than just looking at, okay, caffeine is the main primary ingredient, and you can just track how much, and you can say, okay, on an off day, or on a day where it's a little bit more volume and a little bit less intensity, there you can go 200 to 300 milligrams. And then on a heavy day where you are going to be 100% hyped up, maybe try to hit a PR, then go with 400 milligrams. I know for myself, that's how I do it. I go 400 on my heavy days, and then usually on the other days, I go around 250 to 320. So, of course, everybody's going to be different in terms of their caffeine tolerance. You know, it's based on size, just how much you do drink caffeine long term, all things like that. But the point is to look at that and actually plan it out. Don't go on a day where you're just really tired, low on caffeine, and then you just get hyped up as a last resort tool just to hit your fourth set. That's not the best idea. Of course, it depends on your job situation, but I think you do see a lot of high-level lifters, what they do differently than guys who are just regular Joes in the gym, is a lot of high-level guys, they get a full night's sleep and then plan having a big caffeine intake and then go to the gym 100% ready. Whereas for a lot of normal people who don't necessarily take training as seriously, they kind of just take caffeine as this last resort. And in my opinion, that's just not going to be as effective. It's going to try to make your worst days better and then make your great days worse. Whereas in my opinion, it's better to take the L on the bad days, where you just need to get the volume in and nothing else. But then also go really high up and get really hyped up for the good days. So that's it, guys. Hopefully this was helpful. Make sure to like the video, support the channel, subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.
Shooting star, Biggie died, they shot a star. Who you know in West LA? Bring that ruckus to MAG.